Hello and welcome to another edition of Proselytize or Apostatize. I'm here. My name's David Russell. I'm here with my co-host Titus Kepfer, or my former co-host Titus Kepfer. How you been, Titus?
Pretty good, and it's Kipfer, not
Kepfer,
Kepfer.
not Kepfer. Okay, yeah, you
Yeah,
always get me with that, dude.
it's a weird name.
So what have you been up to, Titus?
Well, I have three babies. I had three babies under the age of 1 for about 3 weeks, and then Zion turned 1, and the twins have arrived about 4 weeks ago, Sebastian and Kai. So it's the baby apocalypse over here. That's the real end of the road.
Nice. So you started a new podcast, didn't you? Tell us a little bit about it.
Yep, it's called That Jesus Podcast. You can find it on all the podcast catchers or at thatjesuspodcast.com. And it's not a debate show like this. We don't argue quite as much as you do and as I used to do on here. But it's more for Christians specifically, talking about issues regarding like the church and missions. We talk a lot about missions and spiritual disciplines, discipleship, that sort of thing.
Yeah, for you guys that don't know, I had to kick Titus off here because he had too many heretical views, and then Jordan just kept crushing him, so I had to let him go. But anyways, I'm teasing. I'm totally teasing. But it's good to have you back, Titus. Today we're here with Jordan Karem. Jordan's been a postmark atheist on this podcast for a long time. Say hi, Jordan.
Hey, yeah, I'm the token atheist.
You are. So tell us a little bit about yourself, Jordan. I know most people know you. If you don't know Jordan, you haven't been watching the show. So,
well, I'm a mechanical and nuclear engineer. I run a podcast called Reason to Doubt, Reason the number 2 Doubt, with another friend of mine named Jared McComb, and we basically just examine all kinds of claims. It can be anything from the political to the religious to aliens, whatever, and just apply skepticism to it. So that's kind of my bag.
Yeah, and a little bit of non-vaxxer stuff there too.
Yeah, the anti-vax
that was my
one was
favorite
fun.
one, man.
Yeah.
And hey, secondly, we have Mike Jones. He's a good friend of mine. We met at work. We've known each other for about 5 years now. And Mike, why don't you tell us a little bit about yourself?
So, as Russell said, my name is Mike Jones. I'm a combat veteran, and I currently do software engineering for a small business company. And honestly, it's my first time doing anything crazy like this.
Yeah, but you've been part of a couple documentaries too, haven't you?
I did a documentary back in 2017, right after Trump was elected, on the polarization of politics within the United States.
Yeah, man. So yeah, didn't you also do another one when you were in combat?
Yeah, so we had the film crew that did Restrepo. They followed us on our combat tour, and none of that stuff has been released yet. It's been 5 or 6 years now, but they did do a documentary on our deployment, because we were in the heart of what is considered the heart of the Taliban in the Kunar province of Afghanistan, where supposedly Osama bin Laden was sitting the day 9/11 happened.
Wow. That's pretty cool. And not only that, but Mike, you also ran for political office at one time, didn't you?
I did do that. I tried that back in it was either 2017 or 2018 for
Video froze.
Yep. Mike, you froze up.
Man, no film crews came and filmed my deployment.
I was just saying, I'm the only one on here that has any non-violent bones in his body.
Well, I'm out of the army now.
Security guard.
Okay, there he is. He's back. You froze up on us, Mike.
Yeah, the connection ran out. I'm in the basement, so.
Oh, right on. So again, just real quick, you ran for political office back in 2018, right?
Yeah, it was for town council in Leesburg, Virginia. I no longer live there. I had started running in hopes to get on the town council and start a political career, and ended up dropping out of the race because what I thought was a promising look at getting onto the sheriff's department, and I didn't want a conflict of interest. I dropped out of the race, and unfortunately, the position I was not selected for. So I guess I dropped out too early.
Right on, man. So, what's really cool though about this podcast is this is the first time since me and Jordan debated on the Kalam cosmological argument that since go upstairs and go potty. Cut that out. It's all live. Sorry, I just had a 4-year-old run down here. But yeah, so this is the first time, like I said, that everybody, since me and Jordan debated, that everybody here's from Virginia.
Huh.
Yeah, Mike's about 8 minutes from me, and you guys are about an hour and a half. So it's pretty cool. We got finally, since me and Jordan, I mean, this is the first time we actually got people from Virginia here to debate. So I'm kind of excited for it. But right now, I'm going to turn over the reins to Titus. He's going to introduce our topic, and we're going to get started on this debate.
Yeah, so the question at hand is there statistical evidence for systemic racism in the police force? So it's not a very hot button issue at all, not one that creates, any sort of strong feelings in America right now, of course. But yeah, of course, there's been a lot in the news since George Floyd's killing about racism and about policing. And I've been following it, and it feels like there's just a lot of, partisan talking points and a lot of emotion, rightly so, because this is something that affects real people. And but as I've been following it, I've really been thinking about, the stats, because stats don't lie generally. And I think that's the real question. As a Christian, when I look at a movement like Black Lives Matter, I want to know if the primary thing that they're raising awareness for is based on truth or is based on a lie. Is there actually racism in the police force? If so, I want to be on the streets protesting it, right? And I've heard people from, different sides of even the ideological spectrum coming out in different places like this. Like I was listening to a podcast by Sam Harris, where he comes out on the side of, I guess, the social conservatives on this issue, which is fairly surprising. And so, yeah, I'm really interested in that. And obviously it's a little bit ironic, we're 4 white guys on here talking about racism, but I think it's super important for us to listen to people.
Well, actually, Mike is Lumbee Indian, so he has a unique perspective about this, Titus.
All right.
Yeah, my lighting might not be perfect, but I am pretty brown.
All right, sorry about that.
If we're gonna go there, I'm also Indian. So I'm just
all right. Well,
Indian.
We've got a little
but
bit.
We're not. None of us are black.
Exactly. What I was saying is I think it's important to listen to Black people and about their experiences on this issue. But the route we're going tonight is fairly clinical. We're not going to be talking about anecdotes or experiences. We're just going to be talking about the stats. Another reason why I think this is going to be an interesting discussion is I think there's a fair criticism that comes from the conservative side of things against, I guess, more of the hard left, that they're not willing to engage in public debate and dialogue with people that disagree with them. And we see some of that happening on college campuses with cancel culture and just, shouting down professors and that sort of thing. So I'm happy to see Jordan. Well, Jordan's willing to debate anything. So I'm glad to see that we're able to bring people from, I'm sure, very different sides of the spectrum to have a hopefully courteous discussion about this tonight. So Jordan will be taking the affirmative. He believes that there is statistical evidence for systemic racism in the police force. So we're going to give him about 8 or 9 minutes to make his case, and then we're going to turn it over to Michael.
All righty. So I'm going to start by sharing my screen. Oh, you disabled screen sharing, host.
Okay, hang on.
I need to put up the technical difficulties screen.
What did I do? Advanced sharing options, all participants. Okay, you should be good to go now. Can you get it?
Yep.
Yeah.
All right, can you see my screen?
Yes.
Fantastic. All right, so like we were talking about earlier, this is an unusual experience for me. Typically, I'm the agnostic atheist, just rejecting the claim, so I don't actually have to show any proof, but today I do, so wish me luck. Today we're asking whether there's systemic racism in American policing. So let's first be clear on what systemic racism is and what it isn't. What systemic racism is not is a bunch of prejudiced people conspiring to destroy a perfectly good system. It's also not explicitly racist laws that cast down minorities. It can include both of those things, but it doesn't necessarily include them. What institutional racism is are a broken system that has procedures or processes that provide disadvantages to minorities. It's the system itself that's broken. And so you can have normal people in a racist system enforcing racist policy. So with that in mind, let's take a quick trip through American history. Black people were owned as property in this country for almost 250 years, starting in 1619 to 1865. Modern policing got its start in America as slave patrols, whose function was primarily to apprehend runaway slaves, use force to deter slave uprisings, and maintain discipline among slaves. After slavery was abolished, the infamous Jim Crow laws in the South began to oppress people of color, and these laws were, of course, enforced by police. It was not until 1964, a mere 56 years ago, that explicit discrimination was outlawed. So clearly, there's no question that at one point, policing in America was explicitly and deliberately racist. The question is whether our criminal justice system has moved beyond those explicitly racist roots, and I say no. So if I'm correct, what we should expect to see is that a Black individual will have worse outcomes when they interact with the justice system than a similarly placed white individual. In other words, the color of one's skin will be a strong predictor of outcomes. So let's look at the data and see if that's what we see. Let's start out west. In California, police have to record data on every person they stop. So it's a great way to see what interactions with the police look like for different people. It's a state that's just 6% Black, yet Black citizens represent 15% of stops made by police. But it gets better. Because police in California also have to record what happens during the stop. As compared to white people, Black people were 2.8 times more likely to be searched, 2.1 times more likely to be handcuffed, 2.2 times more likely to be detained, property search 3.3 times, ordered out of the vehicle 4 times, forcibly removed from the vehicle 3.2 times, have a firearm pointed at them 3.2 times, mace 2.2 times, tased 2.5 times, less than lethal rounds 2.4 times, bit by a dog 3.4 times, hit by a baton 1.7 times, shot by a firearm 1.3 times. If you can think of a negative outcome, particularly one related to violence, Black Americans were more likely to have it happen to them than a white American. And that's for California as a whole. The disparity, as you can see on the graph, is even larger when you get to a city like Los Angeles, whose police department is notorious for violence. Now, this is where someone might say, but Black people commit all the crime. So surely that's why these disparities happen. If white people were committing crimes as often as Black people, they'd be arrested as much too, right? Well, it may surprise you that Black people represent a shocking half of all people incarcerated for a year or more on a drug-related charge, according to the DOJ. So given that, they must be doing just a ton more drugs than white people, right? Well, it turns out that if there's one thing that people of every race love, it's drugs. According to the 2018 National Survey of Drug Use and Health, Blacks and whites use illicit drugs at close to the same rate, 11.6% versus 13.1%. If you exclude marijuana, whites are actually more likely to use drugs, 3.7 versus 2.8. What differs are the drugs of choice. Blacks are more likely to use cocaine and marijuana, while whites are more likely to use meth and opioids. According to McDonald et al. In 2014, there's evidence that police policies disproportionately target areas and activities of Black people, making them far more likely to be arrested despite similar levels of drug use. In other words, it is the color of one's skin that predicts outcomes, not criminality. Police also seem to act in ways that make them more likely to find Black crime. In May of this year, a study examined 95 million traffic stops, or 95 million stops by police from across the country. They found that Black drivers were more likely to be stopped than white drivers, but only during the day, not at night when it was harder to tell who the driver was ahead of time. The disparity lessened then. So that suggests that driving while Black was a significant motivator for police stops. Once stopped, Black and Hispanic drivers were twice as likely to be searched as compared to white drivers, but contraband was actually found more often in searches of white people. In short, despite similar odds of success for a search, Black people were more readily searched than white people, but only when they could be identified by race. Equal actions, unequal outcomes. The study isn't the only one that's found this. The DOJ also found it in 2016. Not only does being Black make you more likely to be arrested, it also makes you more likely to be convicted. According to Racial Disparity in Federal Crime Sentences 2014, Black individuals receive a 13% harsher sentence than white people for the same charge. They're 1.75 times more likely to face a charge with mandatory minimum sentences in the first place. Verdejo et al. In 2017 showed that white defendants were 25% more likely to have their most serious charges dropped or reduced, were 15% more likely to have a felony charge reduced to a misdemeanor, and were 75% more likely to be convicted of crimes carrying no incarceration or not being convicted at all. This effect diminished for defendants that had criminal records. So that shows that prosecutors appear to be using race as a proxy to estimate latent criminality. Interestingly, these trends hold up regardless of socioeconomic status, so it's not merely an artifact of wealth. And if all of that wasn't bad enough, the data almost certainly underestimates the problem. There's no centralized database for police activity. All the data we have comes from self-reports, and only about 40% of law enforcement report anything at all, and they all do it different ways. In May of this year, Knox et al. Showed that this bias in data is likely to lead to an underestimation of racial bias in policing. Quote, when there is any racial discrimination in the decision to detain civilians, a decision that determines which encounters appear in police administrative data at all, then estimates of the effect of civilian race on subsequent police behavior are biased. End quote. Some of their analysis led them to conclude that the bias may be as much as 5 times worse in reality than what is actually reported. And that didn't even include implicit bias of like where police choose to spend their time. If you patrol Black neighborhoods, you're going to find Black crime. We can be confident then that whatever the true scope of bias in policing is, it's far worse than what the data we have shows. And that should be very concerning because the data we have shows a troubling amount of bias. So, Black individuals are more likely to be stopped by police. Once stopped, they're more likely to have bad or violent outcomes. Once arrested, they're more likely to be charged. In cases of drugs, many, many times more likely to be charged. Once charged, they're more likely to be convicted. Once convicted, they are more likely to face jail time, face harsher penalties. At every step of the way, Black individuals have a disadvantage because of their skin. If that's not systemic racism, I cannot imagine what possibly could be. Thanks.
All right, thank you, Jordan. I
was
actually
just about to pop. I was just about to pipe in and say 30 seconds.
Yeah, I forgot to watch the time, so I didn't even know how much time you had. But I will start watching it now, and we'll turn the floor over to you, Mike.
Hey, how's it going? So, everyone from Hollywood elite to NFL players taking a knee during the national anthem and mainstream media want to declare police are racist. They tell you there are disproportionate numbers of unarmed Black men being murdered by the cops, that police brutality is out of control. And according to Statista, there are 670,279 full-time police officers in the United States out of 900,000 sworn officers. There are about 2.1 officers per 1,000 people. Officers come into contact with 17% of the U.S. population. So out of the 328,240,469 people as of 2019, 55,888 people will have a run-in with the police. Of the 998 total police shootings in 2018, 456 of them were white, 229 were Black, 165 were Hispanic, and 41 classified as others, and 107 were unknown. Of those shootings, 555 had a gun, 885 had a knife, 33 had a replica weapon, 38 were using a vehicle, 105 were other items, and 35 were unknown weapons. Of the 47 unarmed, 23 of them were white and 18 were Black and 6 were Hispanic. In almost half of the cases, 22, where the suspect was unarmed, non-lethal force was attempted and failed prior to deadly force. Yes, Black people in the United States are more likely to be victims of violent confrontations with police officers per capita than white people. But why is that? Well, according to the FBI, Black Americans account for 50% of the murders and 38% of the violent crimes, but only make up 15% of the U.S. population. Chicago is a great example, and let's not forget the strict gun laws that are there, by the way. During the first 8 months of 2016, the most recent available numbers, 2,818 people were shot, and only 12 of them were by police. In cities where large black populations, homicide rates shot through the roof during the same period. DC is up 54% in homicides. The U.S. Department of Justice says black people make up 15% of the population in the 75 largest counties in the United States, yet account for 62% of all robberies and 57% of murders and 45% of all assaults. So what is actually going on here? Are we confusing the color of one's skins with poverty and inequality? It's a fair argument. Black people tend to be greater offenders. Statistical calls speaking, they tend to be more disadvantaged living in poorer urban areas with less access to public services. You'll also have the argument about the violent subculture theory. This is the idea that some black communities have developed culture values that are more tolerant of crime and violence. In 2016, a study by Roland G. Fryer Jr., a professor at Harvard, found that racial bias could not be detected in police shootings in either raw data or when accounting for controls. He recommended to Black Lives Matter his recommendation to Black Lives Matter was to seek a solution within their communities rather than changing behaviors of police and other external forces. In 2014, the most recent numbers, 6,095 black homicide deaths were recorded, compared to the 5,397 homicide deaths for whites and Hispanics combined. Almost all of the black homicide victims were black killers. Finally, police officers of all races are disproportionately endangered by black assailants. Over the past decade, according to the FBI, 40% of the cop killers have been black. Officers are killed by blacks at the rate of 2.5 times higher than the rate of which blacks are killed by police. To me, the real problem is socioeconomic disparities along with public perception issues thanks to the bias reporting. Let's not forget the huge role that social media plays in disseminating false narratives and creating emotional knee-jerk reactions.
All right. Thank you. So I guess, David, if you want to jump in here with any of your questions, I'll let you do that. And I want to give Jordan a response or a chance to respond to Mike and vice versa. But before we go there, one thing that I noticed as I compared both of the opening statements is, Michael, you focused on the police killings and shootings. And Jordan, you focused mostly on what at least to me appeared to be nonviolent confrontations between the police and black people, at least confrontations that did not end in death. So Jordan, maybe you can address that a little bit. Why did you not really get into what seems to be the central issue that BLM is trying to raise awareness about, which is black men being killed by the police?
Well, black men being killed is, of course, tragic, and it grabs the headlines, but it's only one very small part of the larger system. So systemic racism isn't just when it comes to a black man being killed where a white man might not have. And that's more the symptom, really, of systemic racism. Where you really see it is in every single encounter you have with the police. Every time a black person interacts with police, they're more likely to experience violence, regardless of how they act. And so that is what's feeding into the perception that Michael talked about. You know, if you have when black people interact with police, even if they're compliant, they're more likely to be injured, they're more likely to experience violence, more likely to be hit by a baton. Nobody dies. Well, usually they don't die when they're hit by a baton. That doesn't make it okay, you know. Yeah. That and so I think focusing solely on the deaths, while the deaths are certainly very important, misses a large part of the picture and can be more easily obscured. So that's why I chose to focus on that.
Sure. And to be fair, the topic was, is there systemic racism, not just focusing on deaths. But having said that, could you comment on what the statistics bear out when it comes to deaths?
Well, so it's unclear, partly because it's a small-ish sample size, partly because the data we have is phenomenally bad. Like I said, all the data we have is self-reported. there's strong evidence that the self-reporting isn't adequate. You have journalist projects that basically use reportings in order to track homicides as opposed to just police reportings, and they usually find about twice as many as the police report. And so our data is woefully inadequate. It's not granular enough. So you have things like Fryer, for instance, that reported bias in every kind of violence, but not bias when it comes to fatal shootings. And he hypothesized that that was because of higher cost for a fatal shooting, but not higher cost if you just beat a black man, but you will get higher cost if you shoot one. But he's one study. You have other studies like Ross, which did a multi-level Bayesian analysis and determined the opposite thing. He determined that people were, on average, black individuals were 3.5 times more likely to be shot while unarmed compared to a white individual. There's a lot of variance, again, small sample size. In Miami, it was as high as 22 times as likely, but again, small sample size, I wouldn't put too much stock in that one thing. A point of fact, in his study, a unarmed black man or an armed white man was as likely to be shot as an unarmed black man. Fryer criticized some of Ross's data and he criticized some of his own data. And basically, bottom line is, if we're going to get to the bottom on the shootings specifically, we need better data. But I think we have good data on the other forms of systemic racism.
So, Michael, Jordan spoke very fast and had a great PowerPoint in his opening statement. But if you remember, could you address some of the data he showed and he shared with us? Is that not evidence for racism in the police force?
So before answering that question, the two biggest questions that really popped out to me during his presentation was, were any of the people that were brought forth to the justice system, had they had prior crimes in their record? Had they committed prior things, or were they in the process of violating parole and stuff like that? So that was my biggest, actually that's both of my points, is what is their prior criminal history, and if they're on parole, are they in violation of that parole when they do in fact get pulled over or they get searched or something like that? Why the question for me is, why is it happening at a greater rate? There's got to be more to it than just, oh, cops are racist. There's got to be a question why are cops reporting, are they reporting to the scene?
Well, first of all, I'm not saying that cops are racist on an individual level. We could remove every single racist cop from the police force and systemic racism would still exist. Like tonight, if I had a magic wand, I could disappear every racist cop in the force. Tomorrow, systemic racism would still exist.
Can I press you? Sorry to interrupt. Can I press you on that? Can you define systemic racism? Because if no police are racist, what systems are in place that are creating racist results?
One more time, Jordan.
Yeah, sure. So like I said in my presentation, systemic racism, it refers to the system, the institution that has procedures or processes that lead to different outcomes for minorities. It favors one race over another. It doesn't.
Talking about legislation?
It can include legislation, but it can also just include policies. For example, you've got the idea of hotspot policing, right? So they send police to where all the crime is. That's the idea. And so, and that sounds great on paper. But if you have, at the same time, you're more likely to be convicted of a crime if you're black, and you're also more likely to be poor if you're black, and you're coming off of these Jim Crow laws, you can get in a situation where the statistics are biased. The things that you're using to identify hotspots are, it's not that they're identified that black people have more crime, they're just more likely to identify black crime and miss white crime. And so the police who are responding to these calls, they may not have a racist bone in their body, but because of the racist system, they are enacting racist policy, and that's leading to racist outcomes. And to Mike's point, you were asking about priors. The data that I talked about, let me pull it up on my thing because I had to move to answer Titus's. So in racial disparity in federal crimes, they found those differences in outcomes based on sentencing from the prosecutors and the recommendations, the difference in ability to negotiate, prior to trial. with the people without prior crime had these different outcomes. So if they had no criminal record whatsoever, a black person had significantly worse outcomes for the exact same crime as a white person did. And that misses some bias, because if the white person is less likely to be charged with a serious crime, that could be another level of bias. But once they had a significant criminal history, those racial differences diminish significantly. And so what I think that shows, and what they believed it showed, was that prosecutors were using race as a proxy to estimate criminality. In other words, a person's skin was what they determined to make you more likely to be a criminal, not your behavior.
So, if I can, would that make it an issue on the system, or would that make it an issue for whoever their attorney was, and for whatever personal reason they had recommended something and it didn't happen that way?
So a system can include racist individuals, but it can also include racist statistics. It can include it's broader than just the individual. But the way we can detect systemic racism that exists because of the system, because it's been institutionalized, is these broad sweeping outcomes. So if we have similar behavior but different outcomes based on race, that's a good indicator that there's systemic racism. Because if it was just one racist guy, then or just a couple racist guys or whatever, then you'd expect to see these sort of things in like isolated areas, but then everywhere else would be fine. So unless like every single prosecutor across the country just happens to be racist, which I guess is possible, it doesn't seem likely to me.
All right. Any questions you have for Jordan, Michael, or anything you want to address that he said there?
No, not right now off the top of my head. I understand that, the system, he's stating systemic racism as a system as a whole, and laws that are on the books. Am I correct, Jordan, on the way the laws work against certain people? Is that how you're defining it?
Yeah, so it can include it. The laws don't necessarily have to be like explicitly racist. They don't have to say like, if you see a black person, they get this sentence, and if you see a white person, they get this one. Like that doesn't have to happen. So it can be those things, but it is not necessarily those things. So we did have those things, back in the early 20th century, but we no longer have those things. But that doesn't mean we don't have systemic racism.
Okay. I just if the laws aren't targeting a certain individual or anything like that, I find it hard to believe that people are picking and choosing because of someone based off of color on what law, or what their sentence is, and what what their punishment is, and everything else like that. And then this just popped into my head. Vehicles driving by, you had mentioned that African Americans and Hispanics were more likely to get pulled over during the day versus the night. I don't know about you, but I know when I'm sitting stationary and someone's driving by me at 60 miles an hour, it's kind of hard to catch a glimpse of who they are. It's kind of a big blur, most cops are sitting away, tucked away, hidden, so they have views of obstruction and stuff like that. So I find that hard to believe that someone can pick someone out like that and just be like, oh, I'm pulling them over because of race.
So it's not necessary.
So Jordan, can I jump in real quick before you answer that, Jordan?
Sure.
Like, for example, I mean, what about okay, so is it more likely that you're going to get pulled over in a red sports car versus the grandma station wagon type deal? Is this included in these studies where they're kind of trying to break down why they're actually doing it? Or are they just, is their statistic and what they're trying to get a statistic for biased in one area of, or one field of research, and ignoring the rest of the demographic, or ignoring the rest of the, and I know you said there's not a lot of data on this.
Well, there's not a lot of data on the deadly violence, just because that doesn't happen nearly as often as the non-deadly violence and the other forms of systemic racism. The study they looked at, it was 300 million stops, but they cut out 2/3 of them because the data wasn't granular enough. So they decided to go with 100 million from all. If you look at the map, it was all across the country, different states, different cities. And it is true that you can't always identify the race of the person in the car. And I'm sure that the police were not like, he didn't have like a notebook with like black and white and he was doing tallies and making sure he did more black people. Like, I don't think that's what it was. But it's still true that even though sometimes you might not be able to tell who the person is, during the day, it's certainly easier to tell who the person is under certain circumstances. And so there was in the data a disparity where minorities were more likely to be pulled over during the day, but that the disparity between white and minority narrowed during the night. And so maybe you have another explanation for that, but the explanation the researchers drew was that it's harder to identify the race of the person at night. And then even if you can explain that away, that doesn't explain away the difference in how often they were searched. And it's important to note that when they searched someone, if that person was white, they were slightly more likely to have contraband. Despite that, minorities were searched far more often. So, like, what's going on there? If it's not systemic racism, what is it?
I understand your point. So I brought up Chicago as like my example, right? They have outlawed. They have severe gun laws and stuff like that, but you have so many shootings every year within that area. I think it has to go with, if I had to, explain why off the top of my head, that the reason New York had an issue with stop and frisk not too long ago, right? Most of their stuff, they have, I don't know the percentage of African Americans that live in New York in that area off the top of my head, but they do have a high crime rate. So, and if the demographic that lives in that area is the demographic that is committing the most crimes, I think it's justifiable that you search that demographic more often than you search others, because you are less likely to find a crime with less people that are committing it that live in the area versus when that demographic is the ones committing the crimes in the high area. It's
Do you agree with racial profiling?
No, that's not racial profiling. That's just having your head on a swivel. I mean, it doesn't matter where you live. It depends on what the crime rate there. You get briefed on what's going on. What to look out for. And I mean, at least this is what, from my understanding, is that you have to be aware of certain things more than other things. So even if, okay, let's say the demographic was, there were, most cop killings are white dudes in a hoodie, you're going to be more apt to be after, your head's going to be more on a swivel that way. So my whole point is this, and I'm not trying to butt in or anything. And this is more like I'm trying to ask questions and trying to understand this, because, I don't know if all the demographics that make up these disparities is black and white, or if they're missing things or what. And that's my question.
Just to be clear, Michael, you were saying that if it's minorities that are committing all the crimes, then you are justified in searching minorities at a higher rate. So that's what you said?
I would say yes, because they're your biggest, if again, based off of demographics that live in that area. If let's just say Alabama, I don't know what their demographics look like, but let's just say they're more white, and like it's like 80% white, 10% black, and 5% other. I'm willing to bet good money that if you were to go look up Alabama, that you would have more white people being searched than you would have black people, even if we were to break it down to the per capita. But I think when you take these other areas that are higher in minorities, you have a greater number of minorities being searched, and I don't think people take it into the per capita. I think it skews.
They do. So in terms of, you said stop and frisk, so we can look at that. The number, young Black and Latino men accounted for 5% of the city population. That same demographic accounted for 38% of the stops. So vastly more than their demographic position would suggest. Despite that, they found almost no crime. Like it was a phenomenally awful policy that specifically targeted minorities and accomplished almost nothing, which is why it was struck down as racist in Floyd v. City of New York.
Well, no, I totally don't disagree with that. I was just using that as an example. I think stop and frisk is absolutely ridiculous because you are targeting a specific race because of stereotypes that have been placed over years of movies and just everything else like that. It's not fair to minorities as a whole. That was just the first example that popped in my head.
So
back to this issue of racial profiling and the way it seems to be turning out is me and Jordan versus David and Michael.
Hold on. Can I talk on the? You talk about crime, and how could it be racist, systemically racist, to target the people doing the crime, right? Like, you want to target the criminals, and if the criminals happen to be black, that's just who gets targeted. I think what that looks at one very narrow part of the picture. So you have to remember that it's more than just the policeman going on the beat. If he's making decisions based on biased data, then he is going to make biased decisions, even if he has the best intentions in the world. So if you have a system where black people are more likely to be convicted, if the places where police do their policing happen to be more black, and so just like with the drug crimes, white people do drugs just as much as black people, if not more, yet black people account for over half of the people in jail for drug crimes. Like, that is vastly unequal. But if you use the drug crime statistics, you're like, oh, well, black people do all the drugs. Guess I should go to black neighborhoods. And so even if you're not trying to be racist, if you have a racist system, then you can lead to more racism, and then it's self-perpetuating. You look at the statistics, all these black people are doing the drugs because they're the ones being convicted. I'm going to go patrol more black neighborhoods. Oh, look, I'm in a black neighborhood. I found more black crime. How about that? And then it just keeps on going. And so unless we are deliberate about divorcing race from outcomes, unless we go in with that specific attitude, we're likely to make the same mistakes over and over and over again.
I want to press David. I want to press you a little bit on what you said about racial profiling. I pulled up the dictionary definition. It says the use of race or ethnicity as grounds for suspecting someone of having committed an offense. How is what Michael was describing not racial profiling? That seems like it's the dictionary definition of it.
I don't know what you mean. I said that if you're getting briefed that there's a certain crime element within your demographic that you're patrolling that day, your head is going to be more on a swivel no matter what color they are. Like I said, I did use the example that if you get briefed, hey, there's a guy in a hoodie walking around, he's white, he's got a hoodie on and he's killing cops, you're gonna look at guys with hoodies, you're gonna be a little bit more suspect. That's all. So
if there's a description of a criminal, that's a little bit different.
Yeah. If it was, I was trying to ask Jordan a question about something else, and that's what I was. It wasn't had to do totally with what Mike was saying, even though some of it could have seemed that way. But I was asking Jordan a question on the disparities more likely, and if those disparities were actually factored into the data that he collected, and that's all. And I think he answered most of that for me.
So you mentioned most of your presentation was on the violence and the how black individuals account for a disproportionate amount of the violent crime that we have statistics on, right? Yeah. And so that is put forward as an explanation as to why black people experience more violence at the hands of the police. Is that a fair summary?
Unfortunately, but yes.
Yeah. Okay. So it seems to me that surely you don't mean violent crime, because it shouldn't matter what crime a person commits. It should matter how they behave towards police. So even if a guy is a genocidal maniac, if when the cops show up, he's perfectly compliant and surrenders himself and everything, the cops don't get to just beat him with a club, right? Like, so it shouldn't matter what crime they committed because of the Fifth Amendment. It should matter how they act. And so it's not really, it seems like you're using violent crime rates as a proxy to estimate how suspects act when the police show up. Would that be fair?
Not necessarily.
Okay, so if a person commits a violent crime, say he robs a bank or something, and when the cops show up, he is perfectly compliant, obeys all of their orders, doesn't resist at all, and goes away peacefully. If that class of people experiences more violence, is that fair?
Well, no, not at all.
Okay, so then it doesn't matter what crime they committed. It matters how they act around the police.
So it's both. I would say it's both. And I just want to point out, since we're on the topic of people being arrested for whatever crimes, in 2018, according to the Department of Justice, 7,115,940 white people were arrested, and 2,826,460 black people were arrested. That was in 2018, and that wasn't just on violent crimes. That was on any crime, period.
Mm-hmm.
Right? And then you had mentioned, and I'm glad you mentioned it, how they act upon officers showing up and stuff like that. Give me 1 second. I have so many notes that I wrote down prior to this. And some of them got crossed out. So you brought up how police officers, how they act individuals when the police officers show up. So that is one of the biggest things upon, regardless of, let's just say police respond to a homicide and the suspect's still on scene, right? Okay. The first initial thing is, all right, it's a homicide. Obviously, this person just killed somebody, so the cops are going to go in ready for some type of violence because a violent act just happened. Now if they comply and everything and they get taken away, then they get taken away. But typically the chances of that happening are pretty slim to none when someone's already committed a violent act. They're still in that defensive behavior, and they're willing to go down with the fight.
So, first of all, do you have a citation for that assertion?
No, I'm just going off of my personal work that I've done. Typically, someone that goes and commits a crime and goes and is in that defensive manner, 9 times out of 10 they stay in that defensive manner.
Okay, so let's set them aside. Let's set aside the people who act defensively and fight the cops and everything. Let's just talk about people who don't resist when the cops show up. In that class of people, if we didn't have systemic racism, we would expect white people to experience force at about the same rate as black people. Would you agree?
Yes, but we don't have it that way. As I cited before through the Department of Justice, white people actually are shot unarmed more than black people are.
But fortunately, we do have, we can parcel out the data, and we can look at just people who are not resisting. So Fryer, for that study I talked about that found no bias in shootings, he found bias on a lot of other things. One of the things he found bias on was for non-resisting compliant suspects.
He did.
Yes, right. So if you had a suspect who was compliant, who had no contraband, who wasn't arrested afterwards, a suspect who was like your ideal suspect, black people experience force 21% more of the time. Now, if there's no systemic racism, why are black people who are compliant and not criminals experience force at a higher rate than similar white people?
I wouldn't say that's a system issue. That, to me, honestly boils down to the person that's making the arrest. I think that's more of a personal issue, not a systemic issue.
It's a system issue if that's the kind of policing we encourage, and it is, because cops who are more likely to be violent, cops who are more likely to shoot, also tend to be cops who are higher paid, who are better positioned in the department, who have higher social networking skills and are rewarded for that behavior. And that citation for that
is why violence is always wrong.
Hold on.
All forms of violence. I don't know why we're arguing about policing.
Network position and police who shoot by Zhao in January of 2020. They took the data from the Chicago PD in particular and found that police who were more likely to shoot were also higher paid. They were better positioned in the department. So clearly people who are violent towards minorities, that kind of behavior is just okay, at least in Chicago. So the system can be more than just explicitly encouraging, hey, let's go beat some black people. The system can also be, oh, you beat a black person? All right. Like, that's systemic racism too. And so you can't just say, oh, well, it's the individual, so let's just put the system aside, it's the individual. Oh, well, that's the system. So wait, You can't just divorce the two. You don't require racist people, but if your system encourages racist actions and doesn't punish racist actions, that's a systemic problem.
So I want to start pulling things to a close here. I did have a question for you, Michael. You mentioned a couple reasons why you think there might be more crime in Black communities, but you mentioned one of them being more poverty in those communities, which is very much the case in America. Can you what's your theory on why there's more poverty in Black communities?
Oh man, this is diving down a rabbit hole that I could spend 24 hours going through.
Give it in 2 minutes.
Oh man, 2 minutes. So let's start with back after the 60s, after the civil rights movement. They dumped a lot of drugs into the Black communities back during that time, and that's when you start to see the downfall of African American families. That's when you really start to see the split of families as a whole. They went from 76% whole families within those communities to our current day in 2020. I think they're down into like the high 30s on families as a whole. And families as a whole, mostly everyone tends to either both parents are working or just one parent's working, providing for that family. So I think that's the first issue. I think there's the division of families as a whole, which coincides with poverty. And then it trickles down from there. After family breaks up, you either have the mother or the father, one of the two, taking care of however many kids. They're struggling just to get by on a daily basis, so they have 2 to 3 different jobs, and the kids are left alone unattended, and they just do whatever they want to do. So I think it just leads it starts a path down a road that is very unfortunate. Kids tend to drop out of high school to help their family through the hard times because their parents are struggling, which lack of education doesn't allow them to get a proper job, which is, then they end up working at, let's say, McDonald's, where they're getting paid, I don't know what their minimum wage is, but let's say $8 an hour. And it's just a never ending cycle of the poverty within that community, unfortunately.
So you said they dumped a bunch of drugs in that community, and that's what started the spiral. Is that at least what I heard? Who is they?
Let's just go with quote unquote the government dumped a lot of drugs into Black communities right after the civil rights movement.
If you want, I can answer that question as to why there's more poverty in Black neighborhoods. It's 2 words. It's systemic racism. There's no question. White wealth is about 10 times greater than Black wealth, and that's been the case for a long time. The war on drugs was certainly a big part, but that's partly because it was a war on Black drugs. We targeted crack cocaine. There was a time when crack cocaine came with higher penalties than powder cocaine. Why? Because Black people did it more. That's who we were concerned about. There's a reason why Black people are half of drug convictions, despite the fact that white people do drugs just as often. And like you said, it's a self-reinforcing cycle. Once you have a system in place where Black people are more likely to be put in prison, then you have fewer people making money. Once you come out of prison, it's harder to get a job. It's especially hard for someone who is Black. In fact, if you are a white person with a record, you are more likely to get a call back than a Black person without a record. That was according to Race, Wealth, and Incarceration results from National by Zhao et al. So yeah, it's a self-reinforcing cycle, but it's a self-reinforcing cycle that draws its roots from systemic racism. And so unless we dismantle this entire system from the ground up, we're never going to get out of it. We basically put the Black race in a hole and then said, well, pick yourself up by your bootstraps. You don't need any help. And that's just not fair.
Jordan, we have a question for you from James Wright. He says, interesting point about the wholeness of Black communities. Why don't you point to the correlation of unfairly imprisoned Black Americans due to systemically racist policing within those communities? I I just X'd out of the live stream, so I can't see the rest of his question. Do any of you have the live stream up? Okay, here we go. Why don't you point to the correlation of unfairly imprisoned Black Americans due to systemically racist policing within those communities resulting in this very issue? Also, Black communities were the only ones getting drugs, which I guess is what you've been doing in this whole debate.
I think I just addressed that.
Yeah, sure. All right. Well, I think since we don't have any more questions, unless David, you have any more questions, I will let you guys just have a minute or so to give some closing remarks, and then we'll wrap up.
Well, since I had the first word, we'll give Mike the last word. So about 1 in 1,000 Black men can expect to be killed by the police. It's a leading cause of death in the Black community. Black men have less wealth even when they make the same amount of money. Black individuals get harsher penalties for the same crime. They're more likely to be arrested for the same crime. It doesn't matter what metric you look at. Are they more likely to be put in handcuffs? Are they more likely to be searched? Are they more likely to be detained? Are they more likely to be stopped? It doesn't matter. Pick a statistic, and it's related to the criminal justice system, and there's a very good chance that Black people have a worse time of it than white people. That's systemic racism. And so we need to stop pretending that racism is an individual thing. It's not. It's not that we have to get rid of all the racist cops. It's that we have to fix the racist system. We need to do that through better data. We need to do that by being honest with ourselves about what's going on. And we need to do that by having compassion and not letting politicians pretend like this didn't happen in 6 months. We need to do this by holding their feet to the fire and making sure that we don't stop until this gets addressed. No justice, no peace.
All right, Michael.
That was a lot. So, like I stated, we use numbers, and I'm not saying anyone cherry-picked anything, but statistically speaking, while some Black people go to prison for same crimes that white people, I think that is different than within the police departments. I think that's within the actual criminal justice system and who the attorneys are and everything else like that. But from my point of view, I don't see it that way. I see, if anything, cops are more hesitant or do not, take deadly force actions against Black people just because they're Black. I see it as different than that. I don't think the system's racist in any way, shape, or form. I don't see it that way, and I find it very hard to believe that. Yeah, I understand that back in the day where there was slavery and everything else like that, totally get it. But today, in this current day and age, all the different laws that we have on books, I don't think there is any racism against African Americans at all, completely. And I do think it's a personal thing. I don't think it's a system thing.
Great.
Yep.
David, I haven't talked to you much about this issue or ever. I know you're politically conservative, so I can put you in a box and assume I know what you think about this.
Sure.
I'm curious about your thoughts on this issue, and what you heard tonight, and just maybe a few thoughts from you as we wrap up here.
Well, okay, so I didn't get very much time to look into stats and stuff. So anything that I say is either, is anecdotal at best. So it's from experience or whatever like that. I did do a survey amongst many Black friends that I have. I actually went and talked to them because I said, hey, I'm doing a debate on systematic racism. What do you think about this? Have you had any of these disparities and this and that? And they said, they didn't think it was a systematic problem. This was the majority said, we don't think it's a systematic problem, but we think it's a perceptual problem depending on who we get talked to by, depending on the cop and this and that. And that, like I said, that's not that's my own statistic, right? So that's kind of like what I got. But I also been listening to some things here and there. I haven't been much into political commentary because I'm back in school now. So I've been studying more theology and stuff again. So what I did here, I heard a great interview with Joe Rogan and Ben Shapiro on this fact. And they kind of were like, okay, they went down just like a very, and I would suggest anybody listen to that interview. They went down that road, and a third party kind of commented on it, and the conclusion that I got was that, yeah, on paper everything looks good, but how everything's being enforced, there's obviously still something there. So that's kind of like where I'm at, because I haven't really dived into it that much. So if I'm passionate about something, you'll see me comment more on Facebook about it. So I would be more into it. So I'm kind of like all over the place when it comes to stuff right now. So
I'll put all the sources that I had for everybody, not just you guys, but anybody on the internet that happens to watch this. I'll put it on the Reason to Doubt page. I mean, I can email it to all you guys too. So if anybody wants to check my work or see what I had, you'll be able to do that.
One interesting discussion I think that we could have maybe on this show, David, is whether or not, if what Jordan is saying is true, which I personally believe it is. I came in this saying that's my starting point, and I've had that reinforced tonight. But if it's true, should Christians support Black Lives Matter? Should they be out there protesting? I know that that's contentious even among Christians who think that there is racism in America just because of some of the things that Black Lives Matter supports. So that would be a whole nother bunny trail we could go down at some point. We did have another question, although we said we wrapped up.
Is it a good question?
Let me see. Trudy Metzger, did any of you research what happened to Black people when slavery was abolished and how that plays into the present? Well, that's a rabbit trail that we probably don't have time to go down.
It wasn't good.
I would recommend Phil Vischer's video on this. He did a really good job outlining some of that. At least from Jordan and I's perspective, a really good job. So, but we do need to wrap up here. I'm going to let you wind this up, David, if there's anything to plug here as we shut her down.
Not really, but I thank everybody for joining us here tonight. Thanks, Mike, and thanks, Jordan. Thanks, Titus, for coming back for a pop-in here. David Paulman said he had a pretty bad headache tonight. He was going to want to join us here as well. But I thank everybody, like I said, for being here. At the end of the day, this show is all about equipping people and engaging each other. And at the end of the day, you decide. Thank you very much.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
You guys.
Here, thanks.